and welcome to Maine Challenge. This week, we're going to talk about racism. It has something that has been embedded in our society, both in this country and across the world, and certainly here in Maine. As the whitest state in the nation, we know we have issues here. We know that people of color and Indigenous populations are twice as likely to experience unemployment and poverty as white people. We know that Black people during this COVID pandemic were 25 times more likely to contract COVID. We see health disparities and housing disparities. White folks, about 75% of them own their home, and it's less than 10% for people of color. This is institutional and structural racism that has not been dealt with for populations of color or Indigenous populations, and we have a long history of this issue and not addressing this issue here in Maine. The good news is it's starting to change a little bit. We're starting to see some awareness. And one of the things that has happened is the establishment of the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Maine tribal populations. And with me this morning are two extraordinary human beings whom I am lucky to have as colleagues in the State House. James Myall, who is a policy analyst with the Maine Center for Economic Policy, and Joby Thoyalil, who is a senior policy advocate with Maine Equal Justice. We have been advocates and allies for a long time, and you both have been very involved in the establishment of the commission and its work. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Great.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you. So first, for people who don't know, can you talk a little bit about what led to the establishment of the commission? And certainly we've had these issues for a long time in Maine, and yet it took us until 2019 to be able to establish the commission. Joby, you want to talk a little bit about how we got there?
Yeah, no problem. So the commission came about when Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, I believe in her first term as a legislator, proposed a bill to establish the commission. I think the initial inspiration was the fact that there had already existed a permanent commission on the status of women in Maine. Mm-hmm. And like you said already several times in your intro, we have long-standing systemic racial disparities in our state. And I know Representative Talbot Ross thought that a commission like this would be one step that the state could take to start to examine those disparities and start to identify solutions in a systematic way and in a government entity. And so that's why she proposed the bill. And in 2019, it was passed and established.
Great. And so, James, I know you were really involved in getting it passed and also serving on the commission. Talk to a little bit about sort of what the lens is. What is the thing that the permanent commission can do that has been so missing in our state government?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I think a lot of the impetus behind the commission and sort of the reason it's there is to sort of be able to sort of intentionally address issues of racial disparity in Maine. I think, especially in a state like Maine, which is, often seen as being predominantly white and having such a large white population, there's a tendency to overlook issues of race and to sweep them under the carpet. And I think that having an entity like the Permanent Commission that is actually focused on racial disparities is a way of making sure those issues don't get left behind and don't get ignored. And I think one of our sort of governing philosophies for most of the commissioners is, this idea that if you don't intentionally focus on race and if you don't look at where those disparities are with this intentional lens, then that's how they get forgotten and perpetuated. So we can't really tackle racism, especially sort of racism that's less of the interpersonal kind, but more kind of the systemic and baked in kind to our laws and to the way our society has structured itself. If we don't look at those intentionally, then they're just going to carry on the way they are. So it takes sort of this deliberate action and the kind of focused look that the commission can do over time to actually really undo a lot of that.
So I want to talk about what the commission is going to do specifically, but first I want to sort of talk about the 35,000 foot view. So with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, there was, I think, a raising awareness anyway, nationally and in Maine, that racism is deep and it is long and it is very much embedded in many of our institutions, from law enforcement to education to everything. And the whole idea of having to address it systemically and having white people sort of take on the issue of addressing this systemically. I think when we look at the history, I think what I see is two reactions. Sometimes there is embarrassment and shame about what, the hundreds of years of history of how we've treated our Indigenous populations and our racial minorities. And that sometimes leads to either, I think, people sort of saying, okay, well, we really don't have a problem here, or that wasn't us, that was a long time ago, we don't have this, and we're just going to keep going, and we'll try and be a little better. And I think other folks say, no, we really have to lean in. We have to do something, as you said, James, have to do something very deliberate, or we're going to keep perpetuating it. But really, how do we move people from awareness to action? Awareness is fine, but it doesn't get us anywhere. I mean, it doesn't change the life of folks who are living this kind of discrimination. Joby?
Yeah, awareness is definitely the very first step, and it's an important step. It's a really important step. So that's actually part of the Permanent Commission's mandate, is to help increase awareness and to help examine and do research to identify where disparities exist, how deep they are, how bad they are. We hope to have data to be able to present to the public. So that's all in the awareness bucket. But awareness is just the first step, and action is needed, deliberate action. And that's why the commission was designed to be an advisor to all three branches of government, because action can happen by the legislature, by the executive, the governor, through all the different agencies, and through the judicial branch. We all know that the judicial system has huge impact on some of the biggest racial disparities we see in society. And so the Permanent Commission those are two things that we're charged with doing, is raising awareness, advising government. And I think another thing that's really important to think about is, we can, with the thought of like learning about our country's history and then feeling guilty about it and thinking, not wanting to act as a result. I think it's about what you can do now. I mean, that's our nation's history, and much of it happened before any of us were able to make have an impact on what our country was doing. Although not that long ago. I mean, a lot of people think, slavery ended a long time ago, but the impact, the follow-up to that, the government sanctioned discrimination, actually, some of the worst examples were still around when my dad was in college, for example. And that's just one generation away. That said, the past is the past, and it's all about what you do now. And one thing that we as a state can do is allocate resources. Almost all the solutions that we know of, just from the research and best practices around the country, almost all require some form of resources. And whenever it comes to deciding how to spend money with governments in our country, that's very hard. It's hard to decide what to spend on. It's hard to decide how much to spend. It's very hard to just decide to spend any, because it's so politicized. But I think that if we're serious about addressing systemic racism and our states, especially our government's role in that, I think that's one place where we need to focus our sort of changing of minds, is the realization that, a budget is a moral document, and this is part of that.
Yeah. So James, talk a little bit about, if you would, about the huge economic disparities that we're seeing. And I think, Joby, I agree with you that our budget is a moral document, and it has been so absent of looking at these disparities or saying that there's any resources that should go to start to correcting those. Sort of the, oh yes, that's a problem, and stir. It's like, okay, well, we'll feel better, we'll do better, we'll be nicer, and it doesn't really address the sort of economic issues that we see. James, I know you've been working hard on those kind of things. Can you share a little bit with what the commission's doing, but also, what we see as disparities?
Yeah, certainly. And I think the economic side is a really good way of looking at it. I mean, I think Joby already talked a little bit sort of about the way in which the need for resources is really key to all this, and sort of making sure that communities of color have the resources they need and are not held back from economic prosperity. So you mentioned already in the introduction, I think, the rates of poverty for people of color in Maine are much higher than for white folks. They have much less access to some of the sort of key tools of building wealth, like home and business ownership. And I think sort of one way of thinking about sort of that, that question of moving beyond awareness that we were just talking about is this idea of sort of collective responsibility. And I think that idea of reallocating resources or making sure that there's enough resources for people of color and those communities. It isn't about saying to individual people, you need to give up X amount of your money to give it to, a person of color in your community. A lot of it's about sort of collectively raising the revenue that we need. And often that means sort of raising revenue from folks at the top of the economic structure who have benefited the most. And you can look back historically in Maine's history, whether that is, the folks who owned the shipyards that thrived on the cotton trade, and some of them were even engaged in the illegal slave trade and made profits that way, or the folks who owned the cotton mills that were, thriving on this unpaid labor to pick the cotton in the South, all the way through to today, when you look at CEOs of large corporations who are underpaying people of color and ensuring that, their wages are so much less than white folks in Maine. All throughout history, it's the people who are the richest and the wealthiest in our society who are, almost exclusively white folks who are benefiting the most from this. And so those are the kind of folks who, I think we would, as an economic organization, we would be saying should be contributing the most to correct some of this. And I think, that's kind of the area where like a lot of the revenue, I think, needs to come through for some of this to sort of address those disparities. And I think, there's a whole array of different areas, from access to healthcare, making sure that people have access to health insurance, to helping with home ownership and undoing some of the discriminatory policies that were enacted, in the 20th century around home ownership, all the way through to making sure that people can go to college without insuring large amounts of debt. So there's, almost every economic issue you can think about, there's a racial disparity there, and it goes to the heart of all of these issues.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Commission's mission in terms of just really applying that racial disparity lens. And I think one of the things that is so exciting about the Commission, it's very unique in my 40 years working at the State House to have a commission whose mission it is to deal with all three branches of government. Usually we only affect the legislature, or we only affect the executive or the judiciary, but to do all three is really important. So I know that in the first session, and you had very little staff and very little resources, but you looked at a ton of legislation across a broad spectrum and tried to tell us a little bit about what that looks like. So when you look at a piece of legislation, how do you start to determine what the racial impact might be, or the racial disparity might be that you're correcting?
Yeah, I would say that because that exercise of thinking about racial impact in the lawmaking process hasn't happened before in Maine. It was new to pretty much all of us at the table. Some of us had started doing this at our organizations with the policies that we work on, trying to evaluate the racial impact. But what we ended up doing at the Commission, which I think is it was very simplistic, and therefore it was a good starting point, and I'm sure we'll refine it. And when I say we, not just the Commission, but hopefully the state will refine this process as we go forward. But all we did was we had a list of about, I forget, I think it was 10 or 12 questions that said, will this bill have a positive or negative racial impact on health? Will this bill have a positive or negative racial impact on housing? For example, it was questions like that. Mm-hmm. And then you answer the question, yes or no. And then there's a column for why. What evidence do you have? What data do you have? And then each question becomes basically a mini research project. So it is actually time intensive and work intensive. But the more you do this, the more you uncover what data is available. You have, and to be clear, James and I are both policy people, so this is the kind of work we do. It wouldn't be easy for anyone to do this, but the more we do it, the more we have a sense of what data is available, what data is relevant, and then theoretically we should be able to do these evaluations of like pieces of legislation much quicker as time goes on and as we have more experience.
Wow, that's incredible. So then you would present to the legislature, for example, if you're working on legislation, here is what the racial impact of this is going to be, so that they put that into their decision making, right, James?
Yeah, and the commission actually put together this report in 2020, which was actually at the end of the sort of last legislative session, where we went through a lot of the bills that were, the legislature had adjourned in March for the COVID pandemic. And at the time, we thought they may come back in and take up business. So we put together a report that listed a few dozen bills that we really thought would have the most impact on racial justice. So that was a concrete example of the kind of work we were doing. And we weighed in this session on some particular bills as they've come up. I think one of the things that we've been discussing is also sort of looking at like what are the most effective ways of affecting racial justice, and like with legislation, are there bills that need to take a more targeted approach sometimes, that really pinpoint disproportionately impacted communities rather than being more general. And we're starting to think more about, the commission also has the power to introduce its own legislation. And so are there issues that lawmakers or the executive branch aren't taking up but should do? And how can we affect that conversation? So those are the sort of discussions we're just about starting to have there.
And that's the part that I think is so groundbreaking and exciting, is you can put legislation in that directly impacts, is intended to help fix those disparities or start to address those disparities. But it also looks at the sort of unintended consequences, right? So you get to look at a housing policy, for example, and the credit, we know that people of color, when they're trying to buy a house, their credit rating has to be much higher for a bank to accept them than someone who is white, which is totally discriminatory, but history or whatever it is. But those things we don't think about, so then when we're extending another housing policy and we're not addressing that piece, then we are just perpetuating or making worse, actually, some of that. So I think that's an incredible opportunity and incredible work that you're doing. So talk to me for a minute about support for the commission. I know when it was originally passed, it was passed with $50,000, and which is, given the scope of what needs to be done and the scope of the work that you're able to do and want to do, it's nothing. So I know that this year we're trying to expand it and to help fund that more. So talk to us a little bit about the status of the commission now and your hopes or thoughts for how permanent we can make it.
Yeah, actually, when it was passed with $500.
Oh my gosh.
So at the very end of 2019 in December is when the appointments were made. And then the beginning of 2019, we started to meet, but it was a challenge. We didn't have any staff, coordinating. It was all Representative Talbot Ross, who's on the commission. She really took on the role of coordinating us and trying to pull us together with some help from folks like James and me who are paid staff at organizations. But there are folks, most of the people on the commission represent, their expertise comes from their lived experience, from the communities they represent, or from the work they've done. But they all have full-time jobs that have nothing really, not nothing to do with the commission, but like nothing to do with the operation of the commission. And so we met as much as we could. We're all volunteer. And then 2020 hit. And then the events of 2020 hit, the revelation of the racial disparities of COVID-19, all of the Black Lives Matter activity that you referred to earlier, Betsy. In that moment, even though we didn't have staff, even though we were all volunteer, we decided we've just got to meet. We've got to figure out what we can do as a commission. And so we really started meeting every week, sometimes multiple times a week. That led to the report that James referenced and all the work that went into that. And we did get a lot of support from legislators. The legislative leadership actually provided temporary staffing to help us do the work of that report. So that was all that showed us, that really gave us a sense of what our potential is as a commission and the importance of a government entity like this. And so when we started this legislative session off, we started with an ask for real funds so that we can have a staff, so that we're not pulling ourselves together in our free time. And so we were really thankful to see that the governor's change package to the budget, which he released in May, does include some ongoing funding for the permanent commission. However, we're actually hoping to get more, because this is a unique time in Maine's history, in the country's history, but as you said earlier, there's so much more focus on this issue right now. There's so much more desire from Mainers, from legislators to understand our racial history and to move forward in a way that addresses it.
Yeah.
And so I feel like not just me, we as commissioners feel like this is the time that if we are going to establish a level of funding that is sufficient, not even sufficient. I don't know if it could ever be sufficient,
right.
But to give us a fighting chance to actually pursue our mission, now is the time to do that. And so we are actually asking right now for more money than what the governor has already devoted to us through the budget. However, we are very thankful for that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's sort of, I agree with you that we're at this pivot point, right? And it's sort of, it's that if not now, when, if this, I mean, we have this like perfect storm of raising awareness, of risen awareness. I don't even think that people's awareness has been risen through a lot of tragic events, quite honestly. And then I think we also have this, this pandemic, but also this money that we, like in my 40 years of being an advocate, only one other time in our history have we had money to actually figure out what to do with. And so if this isn't the time that we make this priority, when will it be, right? So exactly. I think that I'm thrilled that you're doing that. And I hope our viewers will pay attention and make sure that their legislators know how important it is that we correct this injustice that has been so long and so systemic nationally, but also here in Maine, and continues. When we look at our migrant farm workers, and that's not just, it's not just them, but that's one example of an economic, group of people who are struggling mightily, as well as our new immigrants, as well as our Native American population and our African American population. I mean, we see it all the time, and we see it in our corrections department. It's always one of the most striking things. I remember my daughter when she was young. There was a young, it's Cambodian, and so there was a group of young incarcerated youth from Long Creek who came to speak and do a little dramatic presentation. It was amazing. But her question as a 7-year-old was, "Mommy, why are all those kids brown like me?" Because our incarceration rate is so bad. So it's so racially disproportionate to the population. So anyway, I just think there's so much work to do. But James, we just have a little bit of time left here. So paint for me the picture of what it looks like when we really start to address this adequately, and when we start to make some progress. And I know it's going to take a long time and there's no silver bullet, but for you, when you think about this, what keeps you going as one of the commissioners, and what's the hope that drives you or that sustains you, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, in some ways, like in the title of the commission, the fact that it's a permanent commission, and it is, I think, the fact that if we can establish this as sort of routine, ongoing work that is done both by the commission, but then also like it isn't up to the commission to be raising these issues all the time, because it's a philosophy that's embedded sort of in the legislative branch. We already have a bill that passed to have legislators be able to request racial impact statements on bills, which is a fairly groundbreaking policy compared to other states. But to be able to have, if we can embed this culture of legislators thinking about the racial impact when they're drafting legislation and when they're reviewing it, if we can have the executive branch, the governor and then the different commissioners be thinking about that and being consciously working towards those ends, and folks in the judicial branch, when they're making kind of judicial policy or making their rulings from the bench, if they're thinking about the real, racial impact there, I think that's one of the things that's really going to make a difference. So it's not just that this is a discussion that happens when we have a tragic killing in the country or when we have a pandemic, but it's something that people are aware of all the time and are sort of making steady progress on every day. I mean, I think what we saw in the last year is that the danger is that we can all sort of feel the tragedy and feel the intenseness of different moments and have expressions of guilt or outrage or wanting to make a difference, but that can fade really quickly. So for me, I think a lot of it is making this sort of like permanent, ongoing work that really gets embedded into the culture of the state and state government.
Yeah. And Joby?
I think from a sort of more micro level of just thinking about what the commission itself can do, I see once the commission is staffed up and has built even more expertise, especially in the realm of policy, and we better understand the workings of government, I see a commission that is regularly putting out great information, educating the public, educating lawmakers on disparities that exist, potential historical things that led to those disparities, uncovering where data gaps exist, because we know there are lots of gaps in our data that won't currently allow us to answer that question. And that all this stuff that we're uncovering and putting out and educating will inform the policy that is being made on the state and hopefully local levels. And the last thing I'll say, that I forgot to mention earlier, that a big part of our role as a commission is to engage with impacted communities. And so for all the work we're doing, everything I'm talking about, especially the policies that end up happening as a result of the commission's work, is all very much informed and as often as possible led by the impacted communities, the racial, Indigenous, and tribal communities of Maine. And so, and that's an area where we really, because we haven't been resourced, we have not been able to do enough community engagement other than the engagement that we're all doing anyway in our work, in our lives. But resources will allow us to do that.
Well, that is awesome. And I look forward to that day too, as we talk with people who are and work are led by the folks who have this as lived experience. We have the resources to actually do the data, understand it, and then to do something meaningful about it. We need to at least start to turn this ship. We have a long way to go, but the work that both of you are doing and the commission, the Permanent Commission, is doing is really an incredible help towards that. And we are so very grateful for your work. So that's the time we have for today. But I know that we will have you back as the commission moves forward and uncovers more information and can lead us all in a direction that is going to start to begin to address the issue of structural racism that we have that's so embedded here. So thank you for your work every single day, and thanks for your work on your commission. And it's been a delight to have you. And those of you watching, please pay attention to both what's happening in your world, but also what's happening on the state level all the time to see how we can make this a more just and fair society and loving place to live. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.